Good afternoon, Rafael Canati International School students and IDC graduates. I'm addressing you today on the eve of Memorial Day. Memorial Day for the Israeli soldiers who lost their life fighting for the existence of the State of Israel. I decided to share with you on this day my personal experience, my personal story. It may not be unique in Israel, but it shaped my life and had indirectly an impact on the value system of IDC. Yom Kippur, October 1973, Rodfei Tzedek Synagogue in Chicago. I was an usher. At the time, I wrote my PhD at the University of Chicago. I had a 3-year-old daughter, but I had no money. So I reached an agreement with the synagogue. I got a discount, and I promised to be at the service of the community. Therefore, I found myself as an usher on that day. Service started, and the rabbi stood up, and he said, "Our heart is with the state of Israel. Israel is in war again." I immediately apologized, went home, and called the Israeli consulate. It was Yom Kippur, but they immediately answered. And I said, "Listen, I'm a paratrooper officer. There is a war. I want to go back home and join my unit." They said, "There's no point in doing so. You know, we have experience from the 6-day war. At the time you reach Israel, the war will be over." I said, "Listen, it's a question of principle. I cannot be here in Chicago while my soldiers are fighting in Israel." I had no money, but I just had in the bank enough to buy a ticket to fly from Chicago to Kennedy. I asked the uncle of my wife to come to Kennedy Airport and give me a loan that I can buy a ticket to for El Al to fly to Israel. To my amazement, hundreds of people were assembled in the El Al terminal. All of them decided to go back to Israel to fight the war. It took some time, and I found myself among the few who made it on the plane. On the plane, I remember I had a discussion with somebody who was sitting next to me, an older guy, and he said, "You know, how come we are on the way to endanger our life?" And I said, "It's self-obvious. There is a very basic principle. The blood of no one is dearer and more important than the blood of anybody else. If there is a war, we all have to be there." When I reached Tel Aviv, my parents already waited for me at the airport. They said, "We hoped you wouldn't come, but we were sure that you will." And indeed, I immediately looked for my unit. I found them in the north part of the country, next to Kiryat Shmona. But they didn't have any equipment. But to my luck, actually, one of the soldiers was afraid to join the combat. And I reached a business with him. He gave me his rifle and all his gear, military gear, and I gave him my car, and he drove it back to Tel Aviv. We saw some fierce fighting, our paratrooper unit. We conquered Tel Shams, who was the closest point held by the Israeli forces closest to Damascus. We saw some counter effects. And the night thereafter, I commanded the raid into partially deserted Syrian military camp. And we came back from this operation at 4 o'clock in the morning. I went to my small tent and went to sleep. I woke up at 11 o'clock. At that time, a fellow officer was sitting next to my tent. He said, "I didn't have a heart to wake you up. Your brother was killed in action. Here, take the jeep of our commander, and he will drive you to Tel Aviv, to your parents' home for Shiva. So I went back home. A very sad Shiva. My parents were devastated. He was our youngest, he was the youngest son. And after the Shiva, I decided to find out what happened with my brother. How did he die? It took some time, and I got the details, some picture of what happened, that he joined the tank unit in the 1000th part of the Kinneret, and were killed in action. And somebody gave me the name of his tank commander, who was supposed to be hospitalized in Rambam Hospital in Haifa. I went to Haifa. I found his commander. It was really like in a Russian movie of the Second World War. He was lying in his bed. His eyes were patched over, couldn't see anything. He heard me. He couldn't see me. He spoke to me. And he told me the story of the last day of my brother's life. He said that my brother told him that he tried to volunteer or to join his tank unit, the reserve tank unit, in the north of the country, but he wasn't registered there because he got already a permit to leave the country for the first trip that he was supposed to take in his life abroad. He had already a ticket to fly to Greece, his first trip abroad in his life, which was never materialized. He was rejected, and he still wanted to join the action. He took his car and drove to the southern part of the Kinneret, where the tank unit was organized. At the time, tanks came down from the hill with dead bodies, with bodies in the tanks. There was a need for replacement. My brother volunteered. He fought 6 hours in civilian uniform in the tank. In the Golan Heights, in a place called Yehudiya, there were very close fights between the tanks. My brother's tank was hit. The tank commander was severely wounded. My brother took him out of the tank, brought him down, carried him down to a safe place, went back to the tank in order to report that we have a wounded soldier. On his way to the tank, suddenly a Syrian tank appeared, and he was shot in his chest and lost his life. It was just yet another story of the devastation that the state of Israel knew at the Yom Kippur War. I lost many friends in the war. And the war was over at the time, and I stayed with my parents for about a month. And then came up the question, whether should I go back to Chicago to finish writing my dissertation, working for my PhD. And my parents urged me to do so. After painful deliberation, I decided to go back. But before going back, I wanted to see, somehow, I didn't make up a clear reason to see his grave. He was buried in a temporary grave, in a temporary cemetery in Afula, which was before an agricultural field. There were so many people who were killed in action, so they put them, the bodies, buried the bodies and temporarily in this field, in this open field next to Afula. I thought of my brother. My brother had a short and painful life. At a young age, he suffered from polio. He had great difficulties studying and didn't get along with his father, and he left home. In the army, he was at the tank unit, had some problems with his comrades. And after the army, he went and worked as a menial helper to a tractor driver. His life was short and painful. He didn't leave any great achievements or family. But he was clearly a member of that generation of that time. Whenever there was a need, he stood up without, making any personal considerations. Contributed to the defense of the country. A simple person. Didn't have any hesitation running after the war. He simply gave it all he had and paid with his life for that. So I was driving to Afula, thinking of my brother. At the time, the road to Afula had trees on both of the sides of the trees, and it was an afternoon, and the sun somehow played with the trees and brought even deeper memories and greater sorrow. And then I came to the field, clearly not knowing actually what I'm going to do. I found my brother's grave and stood, looked at the grave. A woman that was mourned another grave looked at me, and she came with a bouquet in her hands. She split the bouquet and put part of it, half of it, on my brother's grave and stood next to me. We didn't speak a word. We didn't even look at each other. We looked at the grave. And after a silent minute, she left. From all the war memories, this picture follows me all my life, because this was a picture, this was a moment that showed the unity of us as a people. This gesture, simple, wordless gesture, stayed with me all my life. So I went back to Chicago, wrote my PhD. Took me a long time to concentrate after the memories that I carried with me from the war. And when I came back, the sad story didn't end. 2 years after the war, my father committed suicide on my brother's grave. He couldn't take. He had remorse how he treated his son, and simply he couldn't live on. So he went to his grave and shot himself on the grave. The tank commander, who was wounded in action, who had problem with his hand, he lost one eye, still was able to see with his other eye, got married in Afula to a very nice teacher, teaching in a special school. She drove with a bus back home from school, and a terrorist with a car went into the bus and exploded himself. Nothing was found of her. Only a few book notes with some grading that were flown in the wind of a students. The tank commander had 3 children left, 2 daughters and a young son. The young son, due to the pain and the problems, went to Chabad school to find some encouragement by becoming religious. Chabad sent him on a summer camp to the States, where he went with his friends in a car, and in an accident he lost his life. It seems really, it's a macabre story, but it is the story of Israel. Living in danger, being ready to give whatever we have in order to serve the very existence of the country. Now, I was born in Israel prior to the War of Independence. All my life, I followed the wars. As a child, the War of Independence, then the Sinai War. And then I was an officer, already a reserve officer in the paratrooper on the 6-day war, so a lot of combat. Many of my friends died in the fight for Jerusalem. War of attrition, Yom Kippur War. And even at an older age, I continued serving in certain duties in the military. The spirit of Israel was formulated in our Declaration of Independence. It was hammered in us in the 50s. And it was clearly understood that the most important thing in our life is to defend the country and to create a just country, a country that we believed will become a light into the nations. A country that demands all of us to volunteer, to do whatever we can. And I decided to join academia and later on to build IDC. IDC is built with the same commitment that followed all my life. A commitment to the physical defense of the country. A commitment to be part of the Jewish world. And therefore, we are so happy that the Rafael Kanati students come from all corners, from 90 countries, from all over the world, to join us, to be part of us. And yes, it is very important for us to be a just country, a country that knows how to treat its minorities, a country that is loyal to the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. Here we stand, still devoting our all energies for the future of the country, fighting in war, fighting in defense, fighting with total commitment to the Zionist value system. I'm happy that all of you are here with us in Israel. I hope that many of you will make Aliyah and stay here. And those of you who will return to all the countries you came from should always remember you are part of a unique family. Never forget your commitment.